Hey folks, Chuck Black here. We are doing Quokka walkthrough and we are actually in the 12th walkthrough. We have talked about the development environment for Quokka. We've talked about the initialization of things, of the Quokka process. We've talked a little bit about the user interface. We've talked about the views, and now we are moving into discussing the models. That would be the database and the way that we reference the database using sqlalchemy. So if you've ever wondered where this nice Quokka data came from that you're looking at here with respect to particular hosts, or even some of the status information that you can see that we print out, where does that get stored, how does it get stored, etc., that's what we talk about in this lesson. So we're going to discuss the model API, the sqlalchemy, the way that we define our host and other classes, and hopefully you'll leave this lesson having learned a whole lot more about how Quokka stores information in the database and how we retrieve data from the database. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we've looked at views. We are now going to begin to look at and examine Quokka models. So this is the package for models. I've expanded it. You can see there are a number of items in here. These are Python modules. You can also see, perhaps you'll notice that many of them are capitalized. Not only that, but they are kind of using the camel case that we talked about with a capital letter for each different word in the name of the thing that we're talking about. And that is an indication in Python. Typically, it means that we're talking about classes. So we're doing object-oriented stuff. Now, these things that you see over here, the capitalized ones anyway, are representing what will ultimately be sqlalchemy classes that we are defining that are going to represent tables in our database. So before we go into the code, I want to kind of go over a high-level overview of what we're talking about with respect to sqlalchemy, database, models, etc., and how they work within the whole Quokka thing. So before we dive into the code, let's look at this figure to understand a little bit better what is actually going on. Now, here is Quokka, the service that is running. We know that there's monitoring functionality running in there. We've looked at views already, so we know that there's this view functionality. We know that out there in the wild world, there are devices, hosts, and services that are being monitored. And we know vaguely, and we're about to dive into, that there's a database that's holding a bunch of information. And we've referred to this as the model layer before. So there's this model thing going on that we're going to investigate today. In the actual database, we have tables. We have a device table. We have a device status table. We have a service table and a service status table. We also have, and I'm not showing it here, a service status summary table. And the same is true for hosts. There's hosts and host status summary. You know, you've seen the user interface that shows the summaries that has, over a 24-hour view, the hourly summary. So that's kind of what that is. We're keeping track of workers. In addition to this, we have events that show up. And for doing diagnostics, kind of on-demand stuff, we have a table for packet capture, a table for scanning of ports, and a table for traceroute. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of everything that's in the database, but it is fairly representative of what's there. What's important is the code that we're going to be looking at today, which is the model code. And this model code is aided, it's basically made possible by sqlalchemy, which provides for a translation from our Python world into this database SQL-ish world. Now, it goes a little bit beyond that, and I've expanded this a little bit. Look, keep your eyes right here, because I want to show you exactly what we've done. So yeah, let me go back in case you missed it. Here's my model. We're not making the views and the monitoring stuff deal with sqlalchemy directly. What we are doing instead is we're providing an API layer. This API layer deals in Python dictionaries and well-known type structures, lists of things and dictionaries sqlalchemy, as we've seen by looking over here, there are classes, and this is more object-oriented code. I didn't want us to have to rely on knowledge of all the sqlalchemy details, and consequently, I built an API layer that shields this functionality from the actual sqlalchemy details. We call this in computer science separation of concerns, the general idea of layering and protecting us from the details of the database and of maybe sqlalchemy's object-orientedness, shielding the things that don't need to know about those from it by providing some type of layer or isolating functionality that is unique to sqlalchemy over here, and making this using just simple Python dictionaries, similar to what I've talked about in the 52 weeks of Python stuff where we have device dictionaries. So that's kind of how we have built this Quokka structure. I guess I should say I've built it, because the responsibility or blame is purely my own. So that's how I've built this. So now we can look at the code and see how that works. So with this overview and this picture in your mind, let's begin to look at the actual code. Now, what I'm going to have us look at first is one of these particular model classes that we have defined. So here I have a class called host, and this host is defined in a manner that looks like this. This is how you do things in sqlalchemy. So sqlalchemy, just to remind us, is providing a layer that goes between the actual database calls that are going to be SQL calls into a real live database, and it's providing a Python-based layer that allows me to use Python data structures, in this case classes, to reference these database tables. And it makes it very easy for me to set stuff and to read stuff to and from the database. So that's what we're talking about here. Now this code, what you need to do first of all, if you are not super familiar with this, is understand this. This is the general template or manner or pattern in which we define things in sqlalchemy. So even if you don't understand all of the nitty-gritty details, if you don't understand all of these nitty-gritty details, you can still understand, okay, well, this is how I do it. This is the general idea of what I'm going to do. And at a high level, I define my class. I define the different columns that are going to be in my table, which is defined by this class. And I specify that it's going to be this thing called db.column. And then here I specify, okay, well, I can understand that. This is going to be a text item. This is going to be a Boolean. And this one here is going to be an integer. So that is fairly straightforward. You're familiar with Excel tables. You're probably a little bit familiar with how a database works. And a database has rows and columns, and we will have rows, one for every host, and the columns that will represent the data. I will have a column that's the identifier that helps me to keep track of every item uniquely in the database. I'm going to have a name for every host. I'm going to have an IP address, hopefully for every host, MAC address perhaps, and I will be keeping track of availability, response time, and the last time I heard from this host. Don't worry about this particular function right here. It helps us to actually return something. And guess what? I'm looking at this and I have a bug in this code. Let's fix it right now. I am returning something that clearly I took the copy of what I did for devices and I modified it and made it be host. I called it device. When somebody calls in and looks for this in something like a log file or something, then this function, REPR, which is often used to provide printed output for a particular thing that says, hey, I've got this host here, please give me a shorthand version of what I can print for it. And I was printing device blah blah blah, and it should be host. Now you notice that was in green, so that means that it's not actually a variable, it's just a string that it was printing out. But my hosts were getting printed in cases where it was getting printed out. I'm not even sure where that might have been, but it was getting printed with the word host. And if I go to service, I suspect I might have, nope, I did it correctly in service. So it was just host. You saw me find a bug and fix it. So that's good. You'll also notice PyCharm, what did it do? It changed this to blue so that it's letting me know, okay, this has been modified and it hasn't been committed in my source control yet. But this is my host. This is what I was going to talk about. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what all of these things mean. So let's go through and look at each line here and understand what's going on. So the first thing is my import statement from Quokka. That's my main application that's going to resolve to my underscore init, the thing that has all of the initialization stuff and actually defines my application in it. And also this is where I created the database. So here's my DB. So I'm going to be saying from Quokka, import DB. Now don't get confused by this. This is just what this means is this is going to go back to my Quokka application and it's going to look in underscore init. That's just the way that Flask is built. And it's going to say import DB. So that DB that I just showed you, we're importing that. And now if you're not too familiar with object-oriented stuff, this is a class. This is where I define my class. My objects will be instantiated from this class. And what I'm defining is host. This is mine. I'm calling it host. This is actually going to correspond to a table that's going to be called host in the database. And this thing in parentheses here, this is telling Python, and ultimately it's going to be referencing sqlalchemy stuff. It's saying that I'm going to be inheriting from this particular class. So DB is my sqlalchemy thing, and they have defined a class called model. If I was to do Control B and dive down into this, you can see I am in Flask sqlalchemy, and here's this thing called model. We're not going to try to understand all the details of sqlalchemy. That's the nice thing. They've done that for us, so I don't have to worry about that. But I'm going to be inheriting from this. And if you look at all of my different classes, if we just go through a bunch of these, you'll see, yep, they all derive from db.model. So basically that's telling you that this is the way that you do sqlalchemy stuff, is for your tables that you're defining. You want to inherit from this db.model. The next line here, table name, this is required for certain SQL implementations. I have seen situations where it is required when you're using Postgres. I don't believe it's required if you are just using SQLite, but I went ahead and defined this anyway. Now, what about these underscore? If you're familiar with Python, you've seen this a lot. In general, with classes, when you see underscore before and after the name of a variable, that means that this is intended for use internally. In other words, external people using this class and creating objects from it shouldn't be accessing underscore table name underscore. Now, does Python enforce that? No, it does not. It is just a convention. Many things in Python in the object-oriented world and in other parts of it are conventions in this manner. There's not prohibition from doing it, but that is what the underscores are there for. It's to remind you, okay, this is something that is internal. Now, we a little bit went through this. We're talking about defining these different fields or member variables. They're going to be corresponding to columns that are going to be in the table. And we talked a little bit If it's an integer, then I use this db.integer. Don't just use integer. This needs to be an sqlalchemy thing. db.text is representing a text field. Text fields in sqlalchemy can be of any length, so they're not like strings which have a maximum length in them, so that's nice. Booleans are handled as true or false. Integers are just numeric values that are not float. They don't have a decimal point, etc. And primary key tells sqlalchemy this is going to be a database-y type thing. This is my primary key. It will need to be unique. And auto increment is telling sqlalchemy, I do not care about this value specifically. I want you to give it a value and then increment every new one that I create, and it will end up doing that. Nullable is an indication to sqlalchemy that I don't want you to ever set data in this table if there is not a name associated with it and an IP address. So I've set nullable to false for those two. And yeah, I think that's about it. This is kind of the general definition of my table. Next, we're going to look at how we actually access this data, this table, and data in the table. So we're back here at the slide just to remind ourselves what we're doing and what we're talking about, because just staring at code can get confusing. We talked about the database and how there's a table in the database that's keeping track of hosts. That's the example that we are using. We looked at the definition of host that uses sqlalchemy stuff in order to define our host table. What we're going to look at next is going to be the API that exists between the rest of Quokka and my sqlalchemy host class that I have defined. And so let's go back to the code here. This is host, and what I've done is I've positioned myself right where there are a number of these host APIs that we might be interested in. I have get host, I have get all hosts, and I have set host. That seems to be a good representation. Now, if you're looking at this and seeing that, wow, I'm about a third of the way through this file and there's already 300 lines in this API file, Chuck, maybe you should separate this into APIs that are appropriate for hosts versus devices versus services versus other stuff. And you're probably correct. I suspect that I should do that, but I haven't done it. So we're not going to refactor it right now. I just want us to concentrate on the code that actually does stuff. And remember, this API code is kind of the go-between that is shielding our views and monitoring code from having to know about sqlalchemy class type stuff. So what you will see is, for instance, when I say get host and I pass in a host ID, what I'm going to be doing is and let's just look at this line here and see if we can figure out what's going to happen. We are going to return my host sqlalchemy object, but I'm going to run it through this function that's called get model as dict. So what this is going to do is it's going to translate from my host sqlalchemy object into just a regular old dictionary. And you will see this throughout the Quokka code, get model as dict, whether I'm doing it for hosts, whether, let's see if I have some other code here, get service, I'm doing the same thing here. I do the same thing for get all services, etc. So what I'm doing is I'm shielding my code that lives elsewhere from having to know about all the details of this sqlalchemy-ishness, and it makes it a little bit easier. Now, I'm not dissing sqlalchemy. It's just a class object that I will be using in order to do stuff, so it's not really a big deal. But for those of us that maybe are more comfortable with just pure Python, those of you who may be less comfortable with object-orientedness, then maybe doing it this way is a good idea. So this is what we are doing. So let's look at get host and see what this does. So my get host, something is going to call get host, and we'll look at that in just a minute. and it's going to pass in this host identifier. And so what we're going to do, and let's try to just understand this, I'm going to set this variable called search. And what type of data structure is this? For those of you that are new to Python, this is a dictionary, as you may know, and this is going to be the key is ID, and the value is going to be the host identifier that was passed in. And the next thing that we're going to do, if I try to just read this as English, is this. I'm going to go to my database. Session is what I use in order to be thread safe for getting requested data from the database and for writing stuff to the database. So sqlalchemy, the way that it's built, you're typically using something called a session. And so what am I going to be doing with my database session? I'm going to be making a query from the database. If you're familiar with databases, you know that when you request data, it is in the form of a query. And now what am I passing into query? Well, let's see if I can undo that unintentional thing that I just set. I'm going to be making a query for this particular class called host that's going to be associated with a database table called host. So I'm going to be making this query into the database, and I'm going to be looking at the host table. And what am I going to be looking for specifically? Now, within sqlalchemy, there are a number of different ways to filter and to make these query constructs. But what I'm doing right here is I'm passing in this thing that I created called search. You may have seen this. I can't remember if I've talked about this before. The double asterisks. This is going to change this dictionary into a number of keyword arguments and pass it into filter by. And the keyword will be, the key will be ID and the value will be host ID. You don't have to understand this, but you probably do, especially if you're going through this Quokka walkthrough as somebody who understands Python. You're going to want to be familiar with this pattern that you will see when you change a dictionary into keyword arguments. Now it's going to be making the query, and what is it going to return? It's going to return to me either one item from the database. Remember this ID, when we looked at host, what is it? It's a primary key, so I know that it's going to be unique. So I will be getting one back, or if the ID happens to be bad, it's going to give me none. So I'm going to get one object back. Now this data that is given to me is going to be in the form of a sqlalchemy object. It will have lots of fields or member data in this object that is sqlalchemy related. So it will be a very full and complete, from an sqlalchemy point of view, object. All I really care about are these particular items: the name, the IP address, the MAC address, availability, response time, and last heard. That's really my data. And so what is going to happen is, if I actually do have this thing called host object, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take it and change it from an sqlalchemy class object and change it into a regular dictionary. And that's what we're going to look at next. So I'm going to be returning to get host a dictionary which represents the host actual dictionary, and with just this data in it. It doesn't have all of that internal sqlalchemy stuff. And the way that I do that is I call this function that I wrote called getModel as Dict. It might be better named get sqlalchemy object as simple dictionary or something like that, but I just called it getModel as Dict. And as I mentioned, it's a generic function. It works for hosts, it works for services, it works for devices, etc. I'm going to Control B and go down into it. So this is my function. I'm passed in a model object. What I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate through my model object. Now, in order to get every item from this particular object. It's not a dictionary, so I need to reference underscore underscore dict underscore underscore. That's a Python thing that translates from an object into a dictionary. And I do that items like we've done before in order to give me the key and value for every one of these and allows me to iterate through it. Now, the thing is, remember, model object has a whole lot of items in it that are going to be internal to sqlalchemy, and I want to ignore those. And that's why I say if k, that's the key. If the key actually starts with an underscore, that's the convention that sqlalchemy and hopefully other people creating software in Python use, which says, hey, this is an internal thing, and so you can safely ignore it. So if it starts with an underscore, I ignore it. Now, this is the recursive bit. If I see something that is either a list or it's a dictionary, and I don't think in Quokka I have any of these, but if I did, and if I had structured my sqlalchemy and my SQL tables in such a way that I had tables that had relationships with other tables, then I would need to do this recursively. I'm probably not going to have to do that. So all I'm going to be doing for the most part is coming through here in my model dictionary and specifying that model dictionary with a key of k is equal to that particular value, whatever that might be. It's going to be a string or an integer or a Boolean or whatever. And when I'm done going through all of that, I just return model dict. And so at the end of the day, not at the end of the day, but at the end of that function, I'm going to have a host object that just has keys and values that represent the stuff that I'm interested in, which is this stuff right here. And as you can see, when I call get all hosts, I'm going to be doing the same thing, except I'm finding all of the hosts. You can see up here, I'm getting all of the hosts. This is my query, and I'm going to, for every one, I'm going to change it from an object into a simple dictionary that has the information that we need. So yeah, here's get all hosts. All I'm doing is I'm querying the same table, but I'm getting everything from the table, and I'm returning that. Now, just a question for you, if you're familiar with Quokka, and I don't have it running here, so I can't show you the actual user interface. What do you suppose calls get all hosts? Well, from the user interface point of view, that would be when I am returning the actual table that has all of the hosts in it. So that host tab is going to be doing that. And when I'm getting specific information about an individual host in the user interface, which I do when I get the status and maybe some other stuff, that's when I'm getting just a single host. All right, so next we'll look at setting the host. So now we're looking at how data is set in the database, and our example is with a host. So somebody is going to call setHost, and they're going to pass in a dictionary which is representing a host. And just so you know, a little bit of insider information, it's going to be called by the discovery process and by the monitoring process. So discovery can discover new hosts, and we can also be monitoring hosts, and you can see how the data gets either created or updated in the database. So what we're going to do, this host is going to come in, it's going to have hopefully a name and an IP address. So this is typically what happens when we are going out and we're pinging devices and we learn that they exist. Then we're going to come in, and so we're going to try to find the host by its host name and by its IP address. Remember, we don't have the ID. When we did get host, we had the ID. That's probably, well, it certainly is a host that's been discovered. It's probably being driven, this right here, by a request from the user interface, and that information has been given to the user interface functionality here. We've just discovered this host, and it may not even have been created yet. So we're looking for host name and host IP address. And so we're going to make a request to the database. Again, database.session, we're going to do a query once again. We're querying the host table, and we're filtering by, this is the same thing that we did before, and these search items. We're searching for the name and the IP address, and we want to get one or none of these. And if we do not get a host, in other words, if there isn't a host already that exists with this name and with this IP address, then what we're going to do, and this is really easy, we are going to create a host object. Remember, host is this thing right here. It's my sqlalchemy thing. This is how easy it is. I'm going to create it passing in this data. This is the host thing that just got passed to me. And the result of this is going to be actual bona fide host sqlalchemy object. And all I have to do is do a database.session.add. So I'm going to be adding a new row into that table, and I'm passing in this host object data. It's very simple to add items to the database. When we do things like for status, where we're always creating something new and we're never updating, this is all that updating of status has to do. Now, if we did find something, that means the host has already been discovered. And so that is where this comes in. Now I allow the caller to optionally pass in certain information. Like the IP address is optional. It could be there, it might not be there. The MAC address is optional. Availability, I'm going to hope that there's an availability and that there's a response time, but I check to make sure that those are there. And since I'm pretty sure that the last heard information should be there, I'm pretty certain that this will be there, but I'm checking that just in case. And what am I doing in all of these situations? Well, remember, host object was what I was searching for. And if I didn't have a host object, then I created it. But if I do have a host object, that's where I am down here. So I've gotten this host object. It has all the sqlalchemy stuff in it. All I'm going to do is be setting these fields appropriately, and I'm only doing them conditionally depending on whether they were present. And so I'm setting, in this situation, the MAC address equal to what was passed in, host sub MAC address, host with the key of, IP address, host with the MAC address, host of availability, etc. When I'm done doing that, I now have host object, whether I've done it right here or whether I've just updated it. In either situation, at the very end, what I need to do in order to tell sqlalchemy to go ahead and write those changes to the database, I do need to do what we call a commit. Now, if you're familiar with networking, you know that you commit configurations. In databases, you do a similar thing. This commit operation is what takes the data that has been held in some transient cache, and it actually commits it into the database. So at this point in time, all the data has been written when I do dbsession.commit, and that is true whether I had to do dbsession.add. Notice it's a little bit unbalanced in terms of what we do. Here we do a dbsession.add. You might expect there to be a dbsession.update, but there isn't. All I need to do in these situations is modify this host object, which I've been given. That's effectively doing the update. And at the very end, all I need to do is the commit. So that is how we write data to the database. So I promised you we would look at where these functions get called. So I'm going to look at get all host. It's the more interesting one. I'm going to use PyCharm to help me here. I'm right-clicking on my function, and I'm going to say go to declaration or usages. And it's going to pop this thing up right here. I see host monitor task is going to be using it, and I can understand that. Remember, if my host monitor task, which we'll look at later, we're going to go through and make sure all the hosts are pingable. Of course, I want to do get all hosts for that. And let's look at this get summaries task. Okay, well, when I do the summaries, I'm probably going to want to go and understand what hosts are out there and get all the host information. Now look at this, device views. Why is device views using get all hosts? And I'm going to click on this and I'm going to come in here and say, whoa, well, I guess as I thought, device views isn't even using it. You notice how this is actually grayed out? That's telling me that I don't need to use these. I'm not using these functions in this in this Python module. Now, remember, I separated my views into different packages here. So I have device views and I have my different UI views. Sorry, this is my UI views. I have host views and device views, etc. I separated those out, and so clearly I did not clean this up appropriately. So watch this. I'm going to do something in PyCharm that makes this really easy. I'm going to do Control-Alt-O. And I just did that. I didn't do any fancy modification of what I've been recording. I just did Control-Alt-O, and it actually got rid of all of those things that it doesn't need. And now, guess what? I think I may have seen this before. I'm going to run it again because I think there's a PyCharm bug. Yeah, it got rid of a second Flask import request. So now you can see over here, things are much happier. So good news, I found another problem and I fixed it. So anyway, but we were back here and I was doing right click and I was using PyCharm to help me find declarations or usages. And now you'll notice that I don't have devices views. I just have my host views. And so I can see in host views, I do get all hosts perhaps a couple of times. Well, no, only one time. This is my import. So I am actually declaring it. And down here, when somebody comes into this URL with this piece of URI information in it, what am I going to do? I'm just going to call get all hosts. And get all hosts is exactly where we were. If I do a Control B, this is exactly what we were looking at. This is where we go to the database. We do a query using the table or the class host, which translates into my hosts table. And I'm getting all of the items from it. And then I return a list of hosts. And in the process of getting every single one of those hosts, I convert and transform from the host object into a good old simple dictionary object that Python understands. And then in my view code, let's go back to here, there's another transformation that's going to take place. Remember when I talked about the views? When I return Python data like this, it's going to translate it into JSON data. So when it gets sent across the wire to the browser that's making this call at this particular URL, then it's going to get translated into JSON data. And the JSON data will consume that and it will print it out in the nice hosts table that we've looked at before. So that is how this stuff gets utilized. Oh, I could go back here to my APIs. Let's do the same thing for set host. I haven't even pre-checked this, so let's go see my declaration and usages for set host. So as we might expect, I'm calling set host in two different areas. One area I'm calling it is in my discovery process. That's where we're going to potentially be adding it. I may just be updating it. But my monitoring is where I've certainly already discovered it, and I'm just updating it with the current response time, availability, maybe the MAC address has changed, etc., and that last heard value. So that's where it gets called from. So now you understand a little bit about the database using the example of hosts, how we do sqlalchemy, going back to my picture here, how we are monitoring these hosts, how we use the API layer to communicate in terms of Python dictionary objects, very simply, how we translate those, that gets translated for us for the most part when we are actually writing data out. When we are retrieving data, for example, for the views, We also go through a transformation project where we translate from the sqlalchemy object into a simple Python dictionary. So that's the interface in Quokka between the actual stuff that does things with Python data and the sqlalchemy layer, and also eventually to the database. All right, so what do we talk about today? Well, we're talking about models and how data is stored in the database in the form of tables and how we reference them via sqlalchemy models. We talked about how we have a layer in between sqlalchemy and ourselves running in the Quokka service that is called the model API, and that allows us to do things over here in a pure Python manner, and that it gets translated into sqlalchemy objects that eventually get written to the database. We talked about how this host class is defined and how it's represented by a table in the database. We talked about the general pattern for how sqlalchemy likes us to define things in terms of columns and in terms of the different data types, whether it's integer, text, Boolean, etc. We looked at this APIs layer and how we can get individual hosts by doing queries, how we can get all the hosts by doing a similar query but getting all of them. We talked about how we translate the data from an object that's sqlalchemy focused into something that's a simple Python dictionary. We also looked at how we write data to the database, whether it's adding data or just updating various fields in the database, and how eventually we need to do a commit in order to commit that data into the actual database. Hopefully this has been helpful and you have a better idea of how things work in terms of our model layer and all the mechanics that goes on in between our Python data and the database and how that works. Hopefully not only do you have an idea how Quokka does it, but just in general how sqlalchemy makes your database life and programming much more simple than it might have been otherwise. Enjoy.